Welcome to the NBA slate breakdown for Tuesday night. Just 4 games here. I'm with Brent Hyden. You and I were talking not about basketball, stuff for tonight. We were talking about Clippers Rockets before the show, and it's hard to kind of justify talking about anything else at this point.
Yeah, I've pretty much spent the entire morning looking at memes about this whole situation, but I did make sure prior to recording that I barricaded my back door. I've disconnected my doorbell, so I don't have to worry about anyone trying to distract me at the front door, and I have the police department on the ready. So if I need a police presence, I'll be okay.
I do have some people that I could send to the front door, and it's funny. They say history repeats itself, and we literally just saw a Trojan horse, in Clint Capella. It did repeat itself.
Yeah, it really did. He's from this is what I don't understand. He's from Switzerland, right? Like, isn't he supposed to be neutral in times of conflict? Like, I don't know what he's doing getting involved. Like, he's supposed to be the calm voice of reason.
I don't know. I mean, maybe he had enough. I think the Clippers can get under anyone's skin.
Yeah, they probably can. It's going to be interesting to see um, what happens because they still have to play two more times, one more time at Staples Center. So they might have to block off the secret passageway between the locker rooms for that one.
Yeah, they're going to need extra security. Maybe put like a tank down there in the tunnel. I think that'd be a good choice.
Yeah, it might be.
So, let's talk tonight. A solid 4 game slate. It's kind of a light balanced week, but Minnesota Orlando, this first one here, kind of basically two tailor opposites of defenses. Let's start with this Minnesota side, obviously just in a prime spot against Orlando.
Yeah, they really are. Like, they've actually been really good of late. They've been playing. Sorry, I'm still like really, really distracted. But over their last 5 game winning streak, they've averaged 117 points per game. They've been playing outstanding defense over the last 10 games, the third best defense in the NBA. So it's an excellent spot for the Timberwolves. Probably not a very good spot for the Orlando Magic, who seem to be just unraveling every single game. Over their last 7 losses, they've given up 116 points per game. So Minnesota offense definitely in play here.
Yeah, and I think where I'm looking to start, like, it's obviously I don't mind building around the studs here. I don't mind using Butler or Towns. I think those are kind of going to be the core guys that I build around tonight. I think a lot of people might go, oh, I could build around Cousins or Davis, but it's Butler and Towns that I'm kind of building around.
Yeah, it's kind of the same way for me. Like, when I started prepping for the slate last night, I was kind of under the impression that like Towns would be super chalky given the matchup. I'm starting to wonder if he's going to be a little bit underowned when he probably shouldn't be. Like, we're talking about a guy who, like, he leads the NBA with 37 double doubles. I put some interesting statistics in the GPP article when I wrote about him, but it's just an excellent matchup for him. We know the Magic are terrible against big men. It hasn't changed with Bismack Biyombo being in there. They're still 24th in the NBA in defensive efficiency against centers over the last 10 games. Just an excellent spot for Towns. And given his price, the fact that it has kind of risen to a point where it's really tough to stomach paying for him, like, I think that's going to lead to him being a little lower owned than I expected. And he's a guy that I would absolutely be like building my lineups around tonight.
Yeah, and I'm kind of not really worried about like the previous meeting between these two. I mean, they both, obviously were solid stats wise, but fantasy wise, they're kind of a little bit underwhelming. But, we've seen Butler and Towns both really pick up their play of late in terms of really the ceiling.
Yeah, like, I mean, we're talking about like Towns. You mentioned Butler, but like we're talking about Towns who's like 9 consecutive double doubles. I mean, against the Celtics, he put up 23 rebounds, 25 points in a very, very tough matchup. Like, it's just a great spot for him. I mean, you mentioned Jimmy Butler again. Great spot for him. Orlando defense really struggles against wing players. I would not shy away from playing Jimmy Butler here. It's going to kind of come down to how you construct your lineups, and if we can find value for being able to get him in along with Towns and maybe a couple of the other higher priced guys. But I absolutely love him in this spot.
Yeah, I do too. Jeff Teague's another guy that I am looking at. Obviously, every matchup here for the starting 5 is solid. Teague's a guy who's coming off back-to-back, strong games, over 35 fantasy points. Obviously crushed this Orlando team last time out. Like, he's another one at a fair price if you don't want to pay up. I think you're obviously still getting exposure to this game. So T can kind of fit the bill if you don't want to pay up for Butler or Towns.
Yeah, for sure. And it's something that like I talked about it a little bit in the GPP article. It's something that I talk about quite frequently on small slates. Like I realize a lot of these guys are priced like kind of at the edge of their like abilities to pay off salary. It's a small slate. You have to adjust the way that you think about value on slates like this. And Teague is a guy that you can feel pretty comfortable is going to get you, 30, 35 fantasy points, and he has 45 point ceiling. So like if you're looking at that in cash games, you're pretty happy, even though he's almost 7K on FanDuel and 6,400 on DraftKings. Like granted, that's not generally considered paying off his salary as far as regular value terms go, but it's a small slate. You have to change the way you think just a little bit.
Any interest in Andrew Wiggins?
Sure. I think he's a fine GPP option. Again, not a guy that you would generally expect to be able to rack up the peripheral stats. So he's going to be getting most of his points off of actual raw points. But like rebounds have been up a few of these games. Assist numbers have been there a couple times. Some of the peripherals, blocks and steals there too. So if you want to take a shot on him in GPPs, go for it.
Yeah, like we've talked about Wiggins, I think, a few times since the new year started. Like those peripheral stats have kind of started to creep up a little bit. Obviously, not a great rebounding team. They're 29th. You mentioned the steals. I mean, he's had a steal in every game, but one over his last 10. As at that price, once again, like he's kind of like Teague for me, where I don't mind taking some shots. Although Teague for me is playable in all formats. I think Wiggins is obviously GPP.
Yeah, that's kind of how I'd break it down as well. And then like Taj Gibson, another guy that you could consider. I will say this, the Orlando Magic, one strong part of their defense over the last 10 games has been against power forwards. They rank 6th in the NBA in defensive efficiency against power forwards. So if you wanted to take a stand on anyone in this game, you could take a stand on Taj Gibson, but still you're getting a decent amount of minutes out of him, and there is some upside there.
Anyone else want to talk about from Minnesota?
If you're really just hurting, really hurting for value, you could take a shot on Jamal Crawford. Probably not going to get you more than like 22, 24 fantasy points, but at his price, you'd probably be happy with that.
Yep. I kind of feel the same with Dang too. Like he's been a guy who will hover around 25 minutes or so at times. Sorry, 20 minutes at times. He's shown 20 plus fantasy point upside, but when he's on the court, he's just not used at all. That's the thing with him.
Yeah. It's really tough to trust him.
On the Orlando side, obviously we talked about Minnesota's defense being stout. I mean, they've been second defensive efficiency over the last 10 games, basically just on par with Boston. I think, obviously Boston set the standards this year. I don't like a lot of these guys. I think they're all kind of GPP viable still, just because it's a 4-game slate. And if you're kind of looking to game stack this one or kind of hoping this one stays close, I might take a look at someone here.
Yeah, I think if you're wanting to get exposure to the Orlando side of things, you're obviously looking at probably Elfrid Payton coming off a decent outing against the Wizards. Had a couple down games where he really let everyone down against Dallas and Milwaukee, which were really good matchups, and he really stunk it up. But dude has triple-double upside in just about every matchup he takes the court on. I don't mind taking a shot on him. He's 6,500 on DraftKings. That's a fair price. You're looking at 7,200 on FanDuel. Both fair prices if you want to get some GPP exposure. That would be where I would start. I guess if you wanted Aaron Gordon, he had a huge game against this team last time out. I don't know that I want to chase that given how good Minnesota's defense is, especially of late. So again, GPPs only, but I do expect his ownership to be up there tonight. So I'd probably take a stand and fade him here.
Yeah, he's kind of only one if I'm building a ton of lineups, like I'll get some exposure to. I'm in agreement with Peyton, though. I think his price is fair. Probably a little bit more of a play for me on DK just because he is slightly cheaper. But Minnesota, 15th in defensive efficiency against point guards last 10 games. Like, that's fairly average. It's on par with the Lakers and Brooklyn and New Orleans over that span, who have been surprisingly better against that position. But kind of by this range, like I still think we're going to talk about one or two guys here in another game later on that we have more appeal for.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the last guy two guys you could consider, Bismack Biyombo, whose price just did not change really after dropping 50 fantasy points against Washington. If you want to take a shot on him and cash games or GPPs, go for it. Evan Fournier is a little bit interesting. Minnesota has struggled against spot up shooters this season. That being said, I don't know that I really want to attack that because he probably draws Jimmy Butler for the majority of the game.
Let's move on here. New Orleans and Boston. This is a game that I think a lot of people are going to focus on because there are Cousins and Davis coming into town. But like I said before, like I'm still going to be looking to build around some other names. If we get this, point where Davis and Cousins kind of go for that 45-50, it's not exactly breaking the slate like what Davis did last time out.
Yeah, I think this game is going to be pretty popular, as you mentioned, and I think if I'm, especially in GPPs, which I'm going heavy on GPPs tonight, I'm probably taking a stand and fading most of this game. That being said, there are some interesting options to consider on both sides of the ball.
Yeah, let's talk about New Orleans here first. We'll start with Davis and Cousins. Both, I think, are at a fair price tonight. I was kind of expecting to see Davis maybe jump up a little bit more after that last game, but he didn't. He's still 10-2. He's a little bit cheaper. Both obviously still have some upside, but it's not a great matchup. Boston's a decent rebounding team, but I think Davis and Cousins do have the advantage in terms of rebounding here. I think there is potential for them to rack up some blocks and steals as well. I can't decipher the two. I think it's going to be Davis for me if I'm taking one or the other.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind either one of them. Obviously, if you're building the slide, if you're attacking either one of those guys, you're probably using Cousins in cash games. He does seem to have the safer floor. That being said, turnovers still continue to haunt him. Davis, again, is always just going to be a GPP only play for me, given his injury history. It is interesting to note some dominant big men have paid off their salaries against the Boston Celtics recently. I mentioned Cat earlier, who had a 2020 game against Boston. So Boogie's fine. Like, again, I think I'm taking a stand and fading this game in tournaments, but if you want to use Boogie in cash, go for it. Rajon Rondo's the interesting play here for me. Revenge game aside, we already know that Jameer Nelson is going to be out for this game. In the past, that has led to a few extra minutes for Rajon Rondo and a little bit extra production. Last two games, that hasn't really been there. I think he's worth a GPP flyer in this spot. It does concern me a little bit that they did go out and sign Mike James, though, so maybe their loyalty to Rajon Rondo isn't as strong as I thought it might be.
Yeah, I don't mind him. Like you said, he's worth a shot in GPPs. Rondo seemingly needs kind of a narrative to pick up some of these to play a little bit harder, and I think that'll happen here tonight. But floor is obviously super low, and mints are obviously inconsistent. It's not the greatest spot in the world. Like you said, it's just on a 4-game slate. Like, I don't mind taking a shot.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is a spot like you're counting on him racking out their peripherals, but like the dude's 5K on DraftKings. That's really cheap. Like that comes into consideration as like a guy that you just kind of have to look at just because of the price.
Yeah. I think the one guy that New Orleans, he's been playing really well, but it's tough for me to use him in this spot is Drew Holiday. I mean, he's been excellent, but it's just such a tough spot for him here.
Yeah, I don't see myself really going there. Again, this spot, he's going to be matched up probably with Jaylen Brown the majority of the game. Brown, a good, young, scrappy defender. Really not anything that stands out as far as Drew Holiday being a good play here. Again, if you want to take a shot in tournaments, go for it. Like if you're building a bunch of lineups, you could sprinkle him in a little bit, but it's not really somewhere that I'm looking to go.
No, that's pretty much it for the New Orleans side. Like we've talked about two of the best defensive teams this year, and that's Minnesota and Boston. These first two games, and there's just not a lot of appeal on the other side.
Yeah, there really isn't. Like the biggest weakness in Boston's defense is going to come against the roll man and against post up players. And looking at it, Davis actually 14.5% of the time is operating as the roll man, averages 3.7 points per game, 21.8% of the time he's posting up at averages almost 5 points per game. So if you want to target one weakness in this Boston defense, that could be it. So go for it with that.
Yep. And on the Boston side, a couple plays. Obviously, we're going to start with Kyrie Irving, a little bit cheaper than Lillard. This guy's been obviously fairly safe this year. I think you're kind of looking at a 35, 40 fantasy point floor here. I think when you compare him to Lillard, Lillard obviously has the higher ceiling.
Yeah, that's kind of how I'm looking at it tonight. Like Kyrie's obviously an excellent cash game option if you want to consider him, even looking at his price, but like he just doesn't have a ton of upside here. Like I don't see him coming out and putting up a 50 fantasy point game, which is what I can see Damian Lillard easily doing. So like I'll consider him in cash games. I will probably be 100% fading him in tournaments just because I want a guy that I can envision putting up 50, 55 fantasy points, and I just don't see Kyrie doing that because they don't need him to. They have plenty of options. They have Tatum, they have Brown, they have Horford. Like they don't need Kyrie to come out and dominate the usage and put up a bunch of points.
And we've seen Boston a handful of times this year where they may score 110 points tonight. But you kind of see everyone kind of top out at like 15 to 20 points and like no one really goes crazy. And I think that's what's going to happen here.
Yeah, it's just they're a very balanced attack. So like you don't have anyone really dominating too much unless one of these guys is out, which right now isn't the case. Both Horford and Tatum are probable. They've had a ton of time off as well. So it could end up being an extreme blowout and all these guys just kind of play like 28, 30 minutes and all of them put up like, Kyrie puts up like 35 fantasy points. Horford puts up like 32, 34. Brown and Tatum hang around that area too, which makes everyone cash game viable and no one really tournament viable because I just don't see a ton of upside with any of them.
Yeah, the only other guy that I do like for Boston is Jaylen Brown here. Double-digit shot attempts in 4 of the last 5 games. A good spot here against New Orleans. I mentioned to you, I do think this is a spot where he can pick up a few steals. We've seen multi-steal games out of Brown here before. Price is a little bit higher than I might like. I like him a little bit more on FanDuel where you do have to roster 2 small forwards. I think obviously DK, it's a little bit of a different story, but I think he's the guy for his price. He does have a little bit of upside here. I can kind of see 35 fantasy points being in his range of outcomes, which I think is decent for that price.
Yeah, for sure. I do like him a little bit, as you mentioned on FanDuel. He's 5,500 over there, 5,900 on DraftKings. Still viable again in cash formats if you really wanted to go there. Not seeing a ton of upside with either with him on DraftKings, but on FanDuel because of that block or because of the blocks and steals potential. Like I don't mind using him in tournaments there.
Tatum and Horford, they kind of just get blocked out for me tonight. I like a lot of other options.
Not a great matchup for Horford here. You'd expect, depending on what lineup that the Celtics roll out, that he's going to be either defending Davis or Cousins. So if he's defending Davis, it's probably going to pull him away from the basket even more than usual. So that kind of hurts his rebounding ability. If you want to take a shot on him, go for it. I think both Baines and Tice are guys that are going to see extra minutes given the two big lineup that the Pelicans roll out. Tice is really cheap, has been playing extremely well of late. He's a guy that I would have a lot of interest in, especially given the fact that there's just no good value on tonight's slate.
Yep. Anyone else for Boston here?
No, not for me.
Dallas, Denver next. This is a spot where I was kind of hinting at the 2 point guards being a potential play kind of over some of the other options that we talked about. We'll start with this Dallas side. 2 of these teams have been bottom 10 defensive efficiency against point guards over the last 10 games. Dennis Smith has, been crushing. Like the minutes have been up, over his last 5 games. He's averaging over 30 fantasy points. I think he's going to be a guy that I have plenty of interest in here tonight.
Yeah, I wrote him up in the GPP article again, expecting him to be a popular option tonight. I don't know that he's going to be because it does sound like Yogi is going to be just mega chalk. I don't really care what his ownership is, as I alluded to in the article. Like the ceiling here for him is insane. Going up against just a bad Denver defense. No JJ Barea, so the minutes are definitely going to be there for him. There's really not anyone outside of Yogi that's going to eat into his usage. I was telling you before we started recording, when Yogi and Dennis Smith are together on the floor, Dennis Smith 31.5% usage, 1.21 fantasy points per minute. That's pretty darn solid. He averages an increase of 6.87 fantasy points per 36 minutes. He's just a lock for me. It's just a great spot. Denver, terrible rim protection team. Dennis Smith does end up driving to the rim a significant amount. I have the statistics in the GPP article, so make sure you check that out later this afternoon. But just a great spot for him. Like, there's no way I'm fading him tonight.
My interest, I mean, really with Dallas is all driven in the backcourt. Like, I don't really like the front court here. I don't really like Harrison Barnes on this slate. It really is kind of Smith, and I don't mind using Yogi at his cheap price. Those are kind of the only two options.
Yeah, Yogi's fine. Again, I mentioned that I think he's going to be just insanely high owned. Like, I'm probably, if I were building projections for ownership, I would say probably 50, over 50%. Dude's 3 straight games over 30 fantasy points, still only 4,500 on DraftKings. He is
he's 9,200.
He's 5,300 on FanDuel. It's going to be interesting because he's point guard eligible along with Dennis Smith on FanDuel. So people are going to have to decide which one they want to go with. I'm assuming Yogi will be the higher owned one. Again, I don't mind taking it. I don't mind using them in cash games, just rolling with the ownership there. If you're looking at GPPs, I would definitely consider fading. Because there's a path to him completely flopping here, given that he's probably going to draw some Gary Harris defense, who Gary Harris, for some reason, people don't realize is an excellent defender. So yeah, that's kind of my take there. I don't mind Harrison Barnes. Minutes are going to be there for him. Matchup is solid. You would expect he's going to spend some time being guarded by Mason Plumlee. Depending on what kind of lineups they roll out, it's going to be Plumlee or Chandler. Neither one of them excellent defenders, so I don't mind using him in cash games. He does have a pretty high ceiling given the matchup as well.
Anyone in the front court there?
Dwight Powell, Maximilian Kleber, these guys are all interesting to me as value plays. The last time these teams faced off, Jokic did not play, and it is interesting to note that I believe it's the last 12 games the Nuggets have started Plumlee and Jokic alongside each other, so Dallas is going to have to go fairly big, and I just don't think that Dirk is going to be able to play heavy minutes here, so you would expect Kleber and Dwight Powell and maybe even Solid Mejri to draw some extra minutes.
Yep. I think Powell's the guy out of those names that I'd take the most shots on. If I'm kind of picking one.
Yeah, that's probably where I'm going to. He's been really bad recently, though. And that does, like, he was coming off a stretch of a few solid games and then started, minutes trending down again. I'm not sure what Rick Carlisle is trying to accomplish with some of these guys' minutes from time to time. So none of them are cash game plays for me. They're all kind of GPP targets.
Yep. And on the Denver side, you know who's been bad against point guards?
Dallas.
And I don't know if Jamal Murray gets completely overlooked, but I think he gets overlooked enough and get that range that I don't mind taking some shots on him as well. Like, he's 5,700. He's coming off some poor shooting games against Memphis and San Antonio. This is obviously such a prime bounce back spot. He is a guy that does have to score, 20 plus real points. And if you're kind of looking for anything real more than that, he does have to go up. But we have seen a couple of games where he does notch, 5+ assists. So it's in his range of outcomes. He's my guy that I'm kind of pivoting to if those guys end up super chalky.
Yeah, I don't mind, especially on DraftKings, getting exposure to Dennis Smith, Yogi, and Jamal Murray here. Just an excellent matchup against the Dallas team. You mentioned they struggled 30th in defensive efficiency against point guards over the last 10 games. They've given up the 6th, 7th most fantasy points per game to the position on the season. They really, really struggle against pick and roll ball handlers. Murray, 26.5% of the time this season, 3.8 points per game as the pick and roll ball handler. So good spot for him. I absolutely love. I'm always on the Jamal Murray train. Like, I've been a Jamal Murray and Gary Harris backcourt truther for the entire season, this season and last year. So I don't mind going there. Gary Harris, GPPs only. We'll draw a pretty tough matchup against Wesley Matthews. Matthews has been known to shut down some big time shooting guard players from time to time. So GPPs only there for me.
Yeah, I was going to reference the tough matchup. Over the last 10 games, Dallas 6 in defensive efficiency against shooting guards. Harris, had a decent game last night. He played 43 minutes to get those 37 fantasy points. I like when GPP's here. I just think he gets overlooked at his price, so I'm with you there.
Yeah, for sure.
Front court here for Denver. Obviously Jokic is a guy that I will always kind of have some interest in. You mentioned that he didn't play last time out. Not a good rebounding team. Jokic can obviously still rack up these peripheral numbers. I don't mind going his way as kind of a pivot off Towns or maybe some other guys. Maybe if Nurkic becomes a little bit popular as well.
Yeah, I definitely don't mind using him. He's a solid option to consider, especially on on FanDuel. He's 9,700. Towns is 9,500. Jokic could be the lower owned of the two, depending on what Boogie's ownership is going to be. DraftKings, I don't mind building around him and Towns. You can consider both of them as viable options here. I don't want to skip over Will Barton. Again, I think he's a guy you can get some tournament exposure to, played really good against this team last time out. And if they do end up going small, he could see some extra minutes. So do want to give him a little bit of a credit there. I mentioned Plumlee's been starting alongside Jokic. He's been like a model of consistency for the most part over the last 10 games. I think he has one game where he didn't, or 2 games where he didn't score at least 20 fantasy points. He's 4,300 on DraftKings. He's multi-position eligible there. Let's see, 4,800 on FanDuel. Definitely cash game viable. Don't see a huge ceiling out of him, but it is a good matchup. So don't want to overlook him in the spot.
Yeah, I definitely don't mind, especially on the slate. As we talked about, just kind of does lack those glaring value plays.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, again, as I've alluded to already, you do kind of have to reconsider your value propositions for games or for slates like this. And on a slate where there's not anybody that just stands out as a glaring value, you kind of have to look at it. Can this guy get me, 24, 26, 28 fantasy points at his price? And if he can, and he's that cheap, go for it.
Anyone else in Denver you want to talk about?
Trey Lyles.
Oh, how the hell did we? Jesus, I'm gonna log out.
Yeah, he's coming off a bad game. Only played 20 minutes against the Spurs. What did they lose by 42 points or something in that game? So I'm willing to throw that one out the window. The rest of the time, strong minutes, 29, 29, 26, 31, 28, 27 over the last few games. He's been consistently over 20 fantasy points, over 25 fantasy points in the majority of those games. 5,500 on FanDuel, 5,800 on FanDuel, 55 on DraftKings. Yeah, just lock him in.
Yeah, such easy prices to kind of fit him in. It's a good spot. As you mentioned, it was a blowout last time out. The minutes are still over 25. He's shown, 35 plus fantasy point upside here. So at his price, I'm glad it dropped down a little bit because I feel like it fits it easier on tonight's slate.
He was a lock and load for me when he was 6,100. So at 5,500, there's no way in heck I'm fading him.
Yeah. Phoenix, Portland, last game of the night here. Portland's been playing. I can't figure out this Portland team that's just been lackluster this year.
Yeah, they're usually pretty good at home and usually really bad on the road. Last 3 games of their road trip, they allowed an average of 120 points. Their defense really took a step back on the road trip. Kind of expect that to change here now that they're back at home, so that against a Phoenix team that struggles on offense at times, that does concern me a little bit. But I do kind of like this game, at least on the Portland side of things.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll start here with Damian Lillard. We talked about him having the higher ceiling. We've seen that obviously against Phoenix this year, averaging 50 fantasy points in the 2 games. This is a guy who's obviously going to shoot a ton. I think the assists are obviously going to be there tonight. He's had 8 in each of the last 3 games. He's kind of the other one that I'm kind of looking to build around in all formats.
Yeah, I wrote up in the GPP article talking about him, and something that really stood out to me when looking at this matchup. And I hate being using. I wrote that I hate using past performance as like a source of analysis, but over in 6 consecutive games against the Phoenix Suns, Lillard has notched at least 25 real points. He's averaging 26 points and 7 assists in 2 games this season. One of those games was like a 42-point blowout. That's pretty solid performance. And given the fact that it's basically McCollum and Lillard that do the majority of the scoring for this team, if this game ends up being a massive blowout, it's because those two had huge games. Absolutely love him in this spot. Like, I know his price is over 9K, but I think 50 fantasy points is probably the floor for him here, and I will take that at that price.
What do you think about McCollum here? Like, I kind of like him as well. Obviously, coming off a bad game against Minnesota, Portland didn't look great in general. But another spot where he played in the one Phoenix game this year, put up over 40. We've seen 40 plus fantasy point upside even with Lillard on the court. Fair price at a shooting guard spot that's doesn't have a ton of options up top outside of really 1, 2, or 3. Well, considering Butler's shooting guard eligible only on DraftKings and small forward on FanDuel, but I kind of like McCollum here if I, maybe I'm going some other directions.
He's probably going to be a guy that I would focus more on using on FanDuel, even though he is a little bit higher priced over there.
Yeah.
That being said, he's another guy, 6 straight 20-point outings against the Phoenix Suns. This team hasn't changed that much over the past couple seasons. You would expect him to be able to come out and put up a decent outing here. If you're trying to be a little bit different, I would maybe get some exposure to him in tournaments. He's a fine cash game play. I think the popular route, though, at shooting guard on DraftKings is going to be either Jimmy Butler or using like Dennis Smith and Yogi in those spots. But again, I wrote up in the GPP article, if you wanted to pivot off Lillard, McCollum makes an interesting option.
Yep. Yeah, definitely want exposure to that back court. Front court here, obviously a volatile one. Aminu's fairly cheap. I don't mind him. Obviously, it's a guy who the minutes have been trending upwards. He's been over 30 and for the last 5. Obviously, the blowout against Minnesota, he just wasn't having a great game, wasn't needed. Here, though, I like him at his price.
Yeah, solid matchup. And depending on what Phoenix rolls out, you could see Portland going small a little bit, and he might play some center at times. Interesting statistic, doesn't really have any bearing on the matchup or anything else, but he has more turnovers than assists this season. It's 33 turnovers, 32 assists. But given his price, I absolutely love him in this matchup. Again, a night without much value. I don't know that you can, especially in cash games, like I don't know that you can get away from paying 4,700 for him. Like, it's just a really, really good spot for him.
What a sell on Aminu you just had. Hey, play this guy who has more turnovers than assists this year.
I mean, like, assists aren't really a statistic that you would expect a power forward to rack up that frequently. I just thought it was kind of interesting that he has 33 turnovers and only 32 assists.
Well, I mean, he's averaging what, 1 per game?
Less than, because he's only played 30 games.
Oof, brutal. I don't mind Aminu here. We were talking a little bit about Ed Davis before the show. Guy who's obviously a high energy guy. He's played fairly well against Phoenix in the 2 games. He's going to be limited minutes, but he's a guy who does have some upside at a very, very cheap price.
Yeah, and I just realized my huge fail with math. Math is hard. So he's played 30 games. He has 32 assists. So he's averaging more than 1. So I should probably just like close out and give up. They said there'd be no math. Back to Ed Davis. I do like him as a value option here and a pivot off of some of the more popular options. He's a guy that has seen a decent amount of minutes the majority of the games. He's like, over his last 10 games, he's been over 20 minutes and like 4 or 5 of them. Solid rebound points guy whenever he sees minutes. So 3,400 on DraftKings. I don't know that I would use 3,500 on FanDuel. I guess you could look at him there. He would probably be my value option tonight.
Nurkic, I have a weird, uncomfortable feeling about Nurkic tonight. I want some exposure, but he's going to be obviously a GPP guy for me. Minutes have just been kind of all over the place. I don't know. I just kind of see one of those games where he maybe doesn't top out at 25 minutes and kind of puts up another average game.
Yeah, he's not a guy that I'm terribly interested in. Again, if you want to take a shot on tournaments, go for it. I think in cash games, you're probably looking for a safer option. He's a guy that I have a lot of interest in whenever Damian Lillard sits because his usage rate goes through the roof. With Damian Lillard back, I don't really have a lot of interest in him. Portland's kind of using some of these other guys, the Ed Davis, Zach Collins, things like that. Some of those guys are getting more minutes, so not looking at Nurkic tonight.
On the Phoenix side of things, well, obviously there's some injury news that we're going to have to keep an eye on. TJ Warren sat out. He's questionable for tonight's game with the back issue. Marquise Chris is another one. It's going to open up some value that will be likely pretty popular, but it's not the greatest of spots for those value plays.
Yeah, Marquise Chris is doubtful, not expected to play. So that means Dragon Bender is going to move into the starting lineup. He will be pretty chalky, I'm sure. It is interesting to note because Portland has struggled of late on defense, they have fallen to 30th in defensive efficiency against power forwards over the last 10 games. If you want to go Dragon Bender, go for it. Obviously, burned a lot of people last time out with his absolute dud. Played 30 minutes against the Pacers, 0 for 7 from the field, 0 for 6 from three-point range, only 5 rebounds. That is the full Dragon Bender experience. Like, that is what you're going to get. You're either going to get like a big 43 fantasy point outing, or you're going to get like single digits. You're taking that risk. If in cash games, you're probably rolling with the ownership and hoping he doesn't burn you. You're kind of hoping he's, 50% owned. That way, like the entire field is burned by him. Tournaments, I would recommend probably fading and looking other places.
And I think if Bender plays, it makes me like Aminu even more because Aminu's ownership will severely drop if Bender plays.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat. Like, I think that's probably the route that I will go.
And obviously Josh Jackson would be a guy who fills in for TJ Warren. I like Josh Jackson. He's obviously played a couple of strong games of late. Going to probably hover right around 30 minutes. I don't hate it, but I don't really like the matchup.
Yeah, not a fan of the matchup. I think he's fine. We've seen the upside. He has had a solid floor recently. I guess they kind of had like a meeting with the coach and had like a film session and had a little talk with them, and things have started to turn around. He's a guy that fills up the stat sheet. We're looking at double-digit field goal attempts over the last 2 games. Definitely in play if Warren sits. I think the field probably moves off of him if Warren plays, and if that's the case, I would get more exposure in tournaments.
And obviously everything kind of starts with Devin Booker when we start talking about this Suns team. I don't mind him tonight. He's not my favorite shooting guard option, but he's a guy that, building a few lineups, I'll have at least 1 or 2 with him in it.
Yeah, price coming down a little bit, coming off some poor outings against the Pacers and against OKC and against San Antonio. Did have a good game against the Rockets, which is kind of to be expected. Minutes are solid for him, assuming this game stays close. Usage is there for him. I've been riding the Devin Booker fade train for the past like 4 or 5 games, and it's pretty much paid off for me. I would probably, if you're playing heavy tournaments tonight, I would again probably target some of these other options like McCollum, like Jimmy Butler, guys like that. But nothing wrong with using him tonight. It's more of a game theory play for me. Just he's a guy that everyone kind of gravitates to, especially when you see like TJ Warren sit out. If that's the case, again, it's more of a game theory thing. Like, I'm just going to fade and hope that he doesn't burn me.
Yep. And basically the remaining Suns guards are just all kind of cutting into each other's workload.
Yeah, I'm not going to try to predict Isaiah Cannon or Tyler Ulis or Troy Daniels having a game here. None of those guys are in play for me. And the same thing with the centers. Like, I think last game they ended up using all 3 centers. Like, even Greg Monroe saw a couple minutes. It was only 3, but still, like, I'm not going to mess with that. Like, I think Chandler's going to be chalk. Cash game's fine for a value center option. You're looking at, 24, 25 minutes, probably get you 20 fantasy points, but it's not the greatest of matchups.
Yep. Who do you want to go with tonight?
Can we go with which player accessed the Trojan horse?
Which game has the underground tunnel for everyone to go through?
I am curious what other stadiums have like underground tunnels. That's kind of interesting. Like I want to do some research. That's what I'm going to do today. Forget about researching tomorrow's slate. I'm going to spend this time looking at floor plans for all the arenas.
Well, TD Garden is very interesting because it's the train station that's underneath. So you could get a very old school like spy movie feel if everyone's kind of meeting by the train station after the game. Like that would be one because it's open to the public. It would be very comical to see like Boogie going after someone down there.
Boogie would be the guy that I would imagine doing it.
For sure.
Boogie or Rondo, like those two would be like hand in hand chasing someone through the underground tunnel.
Let's go best points per dollar play though.
Let's see. I'm gonna go with Trey Lyles.
Trey Lyles. I'm gonna stay in the same position. I'm gonna go with Aminu.
I dig it.
That's going to wrap it up for us. We'll be back tomorrow morning for a big Wednesday slate. As always, you can head over to dailyfantasycafe.com, check out Brent's GPP article for tonight's slate, cheat sheets, optimizers as well. Good luck. Stay out of trouble. Don't go down any underground tunnels, and you'll be fine.
Good luck tonight.